Listen, what I'm about to tell you is something the mainstream media is barely touching, but it's absolutely massive. We're witnessing what could be the largest military surrender in modern warfare history, and it's happening right now in Ukraine. Russian soldiers are abandoning Putin's war at rates we've never seen before. This isn't just a few isolated cases. We're talking about thousands upon thousands of troops waving white flags, and here's what they're not telling you about why this is happening. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you're going to understand why Putin's entire war machine might be on the verge of complete collapse. Before we dive deep into the numbers, let me paint you a picture of what's actually happening on the ground right now in January 2026. According to NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, who just released these figures this week, Russia is losing between 20,000 and 25,000 soldiers killed every single month. Not wounded, not captured, killed. That's more deaths in 1 month than the Soviet Union lost during its entire 9-year war in Afghanistan. Let that sink in for a moment. This is according to statements made just days ago, and when the head of NATO is putting these numbers out publicly, you know the real situation is probably even worse. But here's the catch. Former CIA Director William Burns just gave an interview to the Financial Times in January 2026, and he dropped a bombshell that's been largely ignored by the media. Russia has suffered approximately 1.1 million casualties since this war began. That's 1,100,000 Russian soldiers either killed, wounded, or missing. To put that in perspective, that's more than the entire population of San Francisco. That's enough people to fill Madison Square Garden more than 55 times. And this is coming from someone who spent his career in intelligence, who traveled to Ukraine 14 times during this conflict, and who has access to information most of us will never see. Now, you might be thinking, okay, these are tragic numbers, but what does this have to do with surrenders? This changes everything, and I'll tell you why. There's a program called I Want to Live that Ukraine launched, and it's become Putin's worst nightmare. This isn't just a hotline. It's a sophisticated system that allows Russian soldiers to safely surrender. And the numbers coming out of this program are absolutely staggering. According to data released just 2 weeks ago on December 31st, 2025 by the Coordination Headquarters for the Treatment of Prisoners of War, more than 10,000 Russian soldiers are now in Ukrainian captivity. 10,000. That's an entire division. That's more than some countries have in their entire military. But here's what they're not telling you about these surrenders. The I Want to Live project just released comprehensive demographic data on these 10,000 prisoners, and it reveals something absolutely critical about the state of Russia's military. 83% of captured personnel are rank-and-file soldiers. These aren't officers, these aren't commanders making strategic decisions to surrender their units. These are the backbone of Russia's army, the regular troops, the ones who are supposed to be doing the actual fighting, and they're walking away from the war. The statistics get even more revealing. 13% of those captured are non-commissioned officers, and here's where it gets interesting. According to the I Want to Live data, on average, 60 to 90 Russian servicemen surrender every single week. That's the baseline. But in August 2024, that number exploded to 350 surrenders in a single week. 350 soldiers in 7 days decided they'd rather become prisoners of war than continue fighting for Putin. That's 50 soldiers surrendering every single day during that peak week. Think about what that means for morale, for unit cohesion, for the entire Russian military structure. Now, let me tell you something that's going to blow your mind about how desperate Russia's situation has become. Putin's regime is offering massive financial incentives to get men to join the military. We're talking about signing bonuses that are multiple times the average Russian annual salary. They've dropped charges for prisoners who agree to fight. They're recruiting from prisons, from remote villages, from anywhere they can find bodies to throw at this conflict. And despite all of this, despite the money, despite the threats, despite the propaganda, soldiers are still choosing to surrender at record rates. Here's the reality that nobody in the Kremlin wants to admit. When NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte says 20 to 25,000 Russians are dying every month, and when the I Want to Live program shows surrender rates are accelerating, you're looking at a military that's hemorrhaging personnel faster than it can replace them. Do the math with me. 25,000 killed per month times 12 months equals 300,000 deaths per year. Add in the wounded. who historically outnumber the killed by a ratio of about 3-to-1 in modern warfare, and you're looking at another 900,000 wounded annually. That's 1.2 million casualties every single year at the current rate. But here's the catch that makes this situation even more dire for Russia. The British Ministry of Defense reported back in December 2025 that Russia's losses in Ukraine are rising faster than ever, not staying steady, not declining, rising. The Institute for the Study of War cited leaked Russian data from the I Want to Live hotline, showing that between January and August 2025 alone, Russia suffered 281,550 total losses. That includes 86,744 killed and 33,996 missing. Missing. Think about what that word means. It means soldiers who disappeared, who either deserted, were captured, or were literally blown to pieces with nothing left to identify. Now let's talk about what this means for Putin's war strategy. The invasion of Ukraine has already lasted longer than the Soviet Union's fight against Nazi Germany in World War II. That's not hyperbole. That's a fact that El País newspaper reported just 4 days ago on January 12, 2026. The Soviet war against the Nazis lasted from June 1941 to May 1945. That's less than 4 years. Putin's war in Ukraine started in February 2022, and we're now in January 2026. We've crossed that threshold. This conflict has become longer than one of the most brutal campaigns in human history, and there's no end in sight. Here's what mainstream media isn't connecting for you. The largest single surrender of Russian troops before this current wave happened during the Kursk campaign. According to the State Security Service of Ukraine, hundreds of Russian soldiers surrendered en masse during Ukrainian operations in the Kursk region of Russia itself. Yes, you heard that right. Russian soldiers surrendered while fighting on Russian soil. They weren't defending some distant objective in Ukraine. They were in Russia, and they still chose to become prisoners rather than fight. But here's where the story gets even more disturbing. The I Want to Live project published data showing that at least 237 former Russian prisoners of war who were exchanged and sent back to Russia were later killed or went missing. 237 men who survived combat, who were captured, who were eventually returned to their homeland in prisoner exchanges, and who then disappeared or died under mysterious circumstances. What does that tell you? It tells you that the Russian government views surrendered soldiers as traitors even after they've been returned. It tells you that going back to Russia might be more dangerous than being a prisoner in Ukraine. The psychological warfare aspect of this cannot be overstated. Ukrainian drones have been spotted with signs attached to them written in Russian, giving surrender instructions. Russian soldiers have been photographed holding cardboard signs with messages for Ukrainian drones, trying to communicate their desire to surrender. Just this January, Business Insider reported on a Russian soldier who wrote messages on cardboard that drone pilots could see, essentially using enemy surveillance equipment as his only means of escape. Think about how desperate you'd have to be to try to surrender to a drone. Military analysts are now saying that Russia's defense industry could collapse in 2026. This isn't speculation from some random blogger. These are experts who have studied the data, who have looked at Russia's production capacity, who understand that you can't replace hundreds of thousands of casualties and tens of thousands of tanks and armored vehicles when you're under the most comprehensive sanctions regime in modern history. Russia is burning through Soviet-era stockpiles that they can't replace. They're pulling tanks from storage that are 40, 50, even 60 years old, and those reserves are running out. Here's what this means in practical terms. Russia's economy is showing signs of serious strain. Former CIA Director Burns noted in that same Financial Times interview that the war has cost Russia not just 1.1 million casualties, but also a good deal of economic pain. Inflation is running wild. Interest rates have been hiked to try to control it. The ruble has been volatile. Western sanctions have cut Russia off from critical technologies and financial systems. And all of this is happening while the country is spending an estimated $100 billion per year on this war. That's money that isn't going to schools, to hospitals, to infrastructure, to anything that might keep the Russian population happy and compliant. The human cost extends beyond just the military. Reports from organizations like the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine show that civilian casualties in Ukraine during 2025 were the highest since 2022. Over 2,500 civilians killed and more than 12,000 injured. These aren't military targets. These are people trying to live their lives in cities and towns that Russia continues to bomb. And every time a Russian missile hits an apartment building, every time an Iranian-made drone strikes a civilian neighborhood, the international resolve to support Ukraine solidifies. But let's get back to the surrender phenomenon, because this is where the story gets truly unprecedented. The fact that Russia has more than 10,000 soldiers in Ukrainian captivity right now represents a catastrophic intelligence failure for Moscow. Every single one of those prisoners is a potential intelligence source. They know Russian tactics, positions, communication protocols, command structures. They know which units are demoralized, where supplies are running low, how the chain of command is breaking down. The intelligence value of 10,000 prisoners of war is almost incalculable. And here's something the media isn't talking about enough. The I Want to Live program isn't just a passive hotline. It's an active psychological operation. Ukrainian intelligence services promote it through social media, through encrypted messaging apps, through leaflets dropped on Russian positions. They show videos of Russian prisoners being treated humanely according to the Geneva Conventions. They show prisoners getting medical care, getting fed, getting contacted by their families. The message is clear: surrender and you'll be treated like a human being instead of cannon fodder for Putin's failing war. The contrast with how Russia treats its own soldiers is stark. There are documented cases of Russian blocking units, barrier troops whose job is to prevent retreat by shooting their own men. There are reports of soldiers being sent into battle with minimal equipment, with rifles that date back to the Soviet era, with body armor that's basically useless against modern weapons. There are accounts of wounded Russian soldiers being abandoned on the battlefield because the logistics system to evacuate them has collapsed under the strain of constant combat and territorial losses. Now let's talk about the strategic implications of what we're seeing. Russia captured approximately 4,831 square kilometers in Ukraine during 2025, according to the Institute for the Study of War. That sounds like a lot until you realize that Russia lost roughly 473 square kilometers that Ukrainian forces had previously taken. So the net gain was about 4,358 square kilometers, at the cost of hundreds of thousands of casualties, at the cost of tens of billions of dollars, at the cost of international isolation and economic devastation. Russia is trading blood and treasure for tiny amounts of devastated territory that has no functional infrastructure left. The Russian winter offensive of 2026, which started just weeks ago, has already hit what military analysts are calling a catastrophic wall near Pokrovsk. Reports from just 4 days ago indicate that Russian forces are experiencing casualty ratios of 15-1. That means for every Ukrainian soldier killed, 15 Russians are dying. 15-1. Those are numbers that don't just indicate you're losing. Those are numbers that indicate complete military catastrophe. Those are the kind of casualty ratios that end wars, because no country, no matter how large, can sustain that kind of bloodletting indefinitely. Putin's propaganda machine keeps telling the Russian people that everything is going according to plan, that the special military operation is progressing successfully, that victory is inevitable. But here's the problem with propaganda. It doesn't stop bullets, it doesn't replace killed soldiers, it doesn't rebuild destroyed tanks, and most importantly, it doesn't work on soldiers who are watching their friends die in pointless assaults, who are starving in frozen trenches, who can see with their own eyes that nothing about this war is going to plan. The I Want to Live project represents something that's rare in modern warfare. It's giving soldiers an out. Historically, armies fight harder when they believe surrender means death or torture. That's why the Geneva Conventions exist, to try to reduce unnecessary suffering by ensuring humane treatment of prisoners. Ukraine has weaponized this concept, not through cruelty, but through demonstrated humanity, by showing Russian soldiers that surrender doesn't mean the end, that they'll be treated with dignity, that they might even see their families again. Ukraine has created a pressure release valve that's draining Russia's manpower. And the numbers keep climbing. Military recruitment in Russia, despite massive financial incentives, is struggling to meet the demands of a military that's losing 25,000 men killed every month. Putin announced goals to reach 1.5 million active personnel, but achieving that while suffering these kinds of losses is mathematically nearly impossible. Even if Russia could recruit 160,000 new soldiers, which they claimed they were trying to do in spring 2025, that would replace barely 6 months of killed in action losses, not even accounting for the wounded who can't return to combat. The brain drain from Russia compounds the military manpower crisis. Estimates suggest that somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million Russians left the country following the invasion in 2022 and the partial mobilization announcement in September of that year. Many of these were educated professionals, tech workers, people with skills that an economy needs to function. They fled to Kazakhstan, Georgia, Armenia, Turkey, Serbia, anywhere they could avoid conscription and political repression. That's 1 million people who will never fight in Putin's war, who will never work in Russian defense factories, who will never pay taxes to fund the war machine. Let me bring this all together for you because this is where the pieces of the puzzle form a picture that should terrify the Kremlin. You have 1.1 million total casualties. You have 25,000 deaths per month and climbing. You have 10,000 prisoners in Ukrainian hands with 60 to 90 more surrendering every single week. You have casualty ratios in some areas reaching 15 to 1. You have equipment losses that can't be replaced. You have an economy straining under sanctions and war costs. You have a population that's increasingly war-weary, and you have a president who has staked his entire legacy on a war that by every objective measure is failing. The question isn't whether Russia can win this war anymore. The question is how long Putin can keep feeding his soldiers into the meat grinder before something breaks. Is it the military that breaks first when entire units refuse to fight? Is it the economy that breaks when inflation and sanctions make daily life unbearable? Is it Putin's political position that breaks when even loyalists start questioning the wisdom of a war that has cost so much and achieved so little? Is it Russian society that breaks under the weight of hundreds of thousands of families grieving lost sons and fathers and brothers? History shows us that no empire, no matter how powerful it appears, is immune to collapse when the fundamentals rot from within. The Soviet Union looked unshakable until suddenly it wasn't. The Russian military looked like a global power until it invaded Ukraine and exposed systemic corruption, poor training, outdated equipment, and an officer corps more concerned with stealing supplies than winning battles. The myth of Russian military might died in the fields outside Kiev in the spring of 2022, and what we're watching now is the slow-motion disintegration of what's left. The largest troop surrender in modern history isn't a single dramatic moment. It's not going to be one day when 100,000 Russian soldiers simultaneously throw down their weapons. It's happening right now, gradually, every single week, as Russian soldiers make the individual choice that their lives are worth more than Putin's imperial ambitions. It's happening every time another 60 or 90 or 350 soldiers contact the I Want to Live hotline. It's happening every time a drone operator sees a cardboard sign in Russian asking for help. It's happening every time a Russian unit is overrun and chooses capture over death. And here's what you need to understand about why this matters far beyond Ukraine. This war has exposed the weakness of authoritarian military systems. It has shown that propaganda can't compensate for reality. It has demonstrated that a smaller nation fighting for its existence can defeat a larger nation fighting for conquest. It has proven that the international community, when united, can impose costs that even major powers struggle to bear. The lessons of Ukraine will shape military and geopolitical thinking for decades. If Russia's war effort collapses, either through military defeat, economic exhaustion, or political upheaval, the consequences will ripple across the entire world. Other authoritarian regimes will learn that wars of conquest come with costs that can destroy them. Democratic nations will be emboldened to resist aggression rather than appease it. The global balance of power could shift dramatically, and most importantly, hundreds of thousands of lives could be saved, both Ukrainian and Russian, soldiers and civilians who won't have to die for one man's ego. But we're not there yet. The war continues. Men are still dying by the thousands every week. Ukrainian cities are still being bombed. Russian soldiers are still being sent to the front with inadequate equipment and no realistic hope of victory. The question is how much longer this can continue before something fundamental breaks in Russia's ability to sustain the conflict. All indicators suggest we're approaching that breaking point, that the surrender phenomenon we're witnessing is an early symptom of systemic collapse. Stay informed about what's happening. Don't just rely on mainstream headlines that focus on daily battle maps and political posturing. Look at the underlying data. Follow the casualty numbers. Watch the surrender statistics. Pay attention to economic indicators from Russia. Track the statements from intelligence officials and military analysts who have access to classified information. The story of this war is being written in those numbers, and they're telling us that Putin's empire isn't just bleeding anymore. It's hemorrhaging, and no amount of propaganda can stop that kind of bleeding. This is the reality they don't want you to see. This is the context that gets lost in 30-second news clips. This is why understanding the full picture matters. The largest troop surrender in modern history is happening now, slowly but inexorably. And it's a sign that this war can't continue indefinitely at this pace. Something has to give. The question is what breaks first, and when, and what the world looks like when it does. Make sure you're watching when it happens. Subscribe if you want to stay ahead of the mainstream narrative. Hit that notification bell because this story is far from over. And let me know in the comments what you think happens next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.